to the H&S Distinguished Speaker in the Humanities Lecture Series. This series was established in 2000, so it's almost 20 years old, by then Dean Ehrlich to showcase and highlight the relevance of the humanities, and it is one of the most important academic events of our year. So when I started, because I just started here this year, one of the first things that I noticed is that when you walk to the dean's office, there are these beautiful posters displayed all around the office from the past lectures. And this evening's poster, it will soon join their ranks. So distinguished speakers in past years have ranged from Salman Rushdie to Art Spiegelman to Martha Nussbaum and Karen Armstrong, just to name a few. And as you can imagine, the breadth of topics has been most impressive. So I'd like to take just a moment to thank the wonderful humanities department chairs, which serves as the organizing committee, and in particular, my colleagues Michael Trotty and Vivian Bruce Conger for their work in bringing tonight's distinguished speaker and the programming which surrounded it. And in addition, Brendan Murday and Ashley Bone from my office have been instrumental in getting this all off the ground. So this year, we are so fortunate to welcome the historian Jacquelyn Dowd to speak about her latest book. And at this point, I am going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Michael Trotty, professor of history, to give an introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Stein, and thank you all for coming. I see members of the local community and some folks from Cornell. Some Dowds are here, family of our distinguished speaker, and of course a number of students, including 14 of you, who tomorrow will be able to sit down with Jacquelyn Hall and talk about her book. I'm looking forward to that quite a bit. We've been reading it as the semester has been going along. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. I have known her for more than 25 years, and from what she has taught me about writing, about scholarship, research, about being a teacher, she is one of the mentors that I've had through my life, and it makes me in a sort of a pickle in this moment, because in one sense I just want to go on and on about different sides of how she's been important to the field as well as in my life. I also know my job is to get off this stage so that she can get on. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background so that you all have an idea of where she is coming from and what she has done, and leave it to her, of course, to talk about this wonderful book about sisterhood and family and 20th century U.S. history. Jacquelyn Hall was born in Oklahoma, went to college at Southwestern of Memphis, which is now called Rhodes College, and then moved to New York City, Columbia University. This was in the late 60s, early 70s, when the whole nation was changing its nature, and the field of history. I just realized I'm going in and out of the microphone, aren't I? I'm not used to having a microphone. In fact, I might just step to the side and be loud. I'm much more comfortable that way. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll just be my loud self. Oh, a little louder. Okay, then I'm going to use the mic. Sorry for the back and forth. This is the early 70s, the late 60s, when everything's changing, and the field of history is changing. It is being transformed. So Southern history, there were writers of Southern history before this, but the nature of Southern history was changing. It is a little bit of an overstatement, but not much of one, that women's history was being invented in this era, and African American history was being invented in this era. And the people who are pushing to make history broader and more inclusive, as much as anybody else in the late 60s and early 70s, were the graduate students who were a part of Jacquelyn Hall's cohort. Her dissertation, which became her first book, Revolt Against Chivalry, Jessie Daniel Ames and the Women's Campaign Against Lynching, was about a Southern woman who just would not keep to her place, refused to keep the place that Southerners and the conservative society she was raised in thought was most appropriate. In an era in which Congress could not pass an anti-lynching bill, She is a white Southern woman who is making a public stand against lynching. It was an audacious thing to do, and it's a fascinating and important story. She came to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the mid-70s and started an oral history program, a new methodology to go along with all of the new history that's happening in this moment. There's a turn in her career toward labor history. Let's take on something, yet another side that's new for her, and a collaboration with 5 graduate students. So let's do it with new methods, oral history, a new field, labor history, and a new process, working collaboratively with 5 other authors. One of those authors is, by the way, with us here tonight. We have 2 of the 5 authors of Like a Family with us. Like a Family, The Making of a Southern Cotton Mill World came out in 1987. And this was a central moment in Jacquelyn's life, she reflected later, and it turns out to be a central moment in the history of Southern workers. And around this book is built a burgeoning scholarship that was not there in an earlier era. She wrote, "In the course of writing Like a Family," this is looking back, "I became a historian. What I learned above all was how to rely on other people, how to be part of a scholarly community." Well, this experiment in oral history and labor history in collaboration worked out very well. The book was named the best labor history book of the year, the best American history book of the year as well. Since then, she's written on memory and autobiography, on the long civil rights movement, how for generations before what we think of as the civil rights movement proper, the African American community was building the capacity to make that great set of social changes. She wrote on another Southern woman who refused to stay in the place that a conservative Southern society wanted her to stay in. In the progressive era, her name was O. Delight Smith, one of the best names I've run across in a history article. When you are a gifted writer, when you find a terrific story, you often find terrific names to go along with it. O. Delight Smith, Trixie Perry, Texas Bill, these are other figures in some of her work. In the 1990s, she was president of a labor history professional organization, and then the Southern Historical Association, and then the Organization of American Historians, 3 presidencies. She was given, Bill Clinton gave her the National Medal of the Humanities in 1999, especially for her work in the Southern Oral History Program. Her current book, Sisters and Rebels, A Struggle for the Soul of America, follows a family of extraordinary Southern women, particularly the 2 youngest daughters, Grace and Catherine, born to a conservative family who venerated the lost cause, and then they went off to college. The story changes quite a bit. It is a beautifully written story about the Red Scare, Sacco and Vanzetti, World War I, transformation in the Depression era, Bohemian New York City leftist circles that Grace and Catherine are in. At one point, Whittaker Chambers, the famous communist turned informer, is a housemate of Grace Lumpkin. So woven into the story of the lives of these women is the story of much of the 20th century in America. It's a marvelous piece. More than that, it's about liberalism and conservatism. And it's about how those aren't separate things that are experienced. Liberals are over here and conservatives are over here. It's about how liberalism and conservatism are woven into the experiences of families and individual lives. I want to close with a brief final reflection that Dr. Hall made about her own work. I have always been drawn to women on the margins, exiles, internal exiles, women who resist assimilation into conventional narratives, women whose place in Southern history can only be established with a fight. Can you all please join me in welcoming our 2019 Distinguished Speaker in the Humanities, Professor Jacquelyn Dowd.
Saying those things. I'm glad I did. Put this little microphone on. So, Sisters and Rebels weaves together the stories of Elizabeth, Grace, and Catherine Dupree Montgomery, three sisters who were born into a former slave-owning family and, as Michael said, steeped in a foundational belief in white supremacy, romantic view of slavery, and devotion to the lost cause. Can people in the back hear me? Right. Like the rest of us, they did not get to choose the family they were born into, or the place where they were born, or the beliefs that were drilled into them by their parents. But they did have a choice about how to work through that legacy. And this book is about how the fraught ties of sisterhood were tested and torn as each woman grappled with that legacy in her own way. Combining biography with history, it also spirals outward, gathering up and illuminating larger stories of the events and social movements and networks in which these women were involved. And as it does so, it recovers a history of interracial coalition building and progressive struggle that was organic to the South and that included expatriates as well as people who never left the region. My overarching goals in this book echo the goals that Grace and Catherine, the two younger sisters, pursued. Like them, I want to join in an ongoing conversation about how white Americans can work through legacy of slavery, segregation, systemic racism, America's, not just the South's, original sin. I also want to provide what we used to call in the 60s and 70s, and I still like to call a usable past for the battles we are fighting in a battleground region. Catherine Dupree Lumpkin is best known for her 1946 autobiography, The Making of a Southerner. I first read that book in the early 1970s. I was a graduate student at Columbia, but living in Atlanta, immersed in a community of civil rights, anti-war, and feminist activists who gravitated to the city as SNCC and the Southern Student Organizing, the hallmark student groups of the 60s, disbanded. I was working for a civil rights organization and trying to write a dissertation in the then brand new field of women's history. It was in the course of writing that dissertation that I stumbled on Catherine's book. The Deep South slave-owning, ancestor-worshiping background she wrote about could not have been further from my upbringing in Oklahoma, where one of my grandfathers was a sharecropper and a barber who could barely read and write, and one was the son of Irish immigrants who spent his childhood in and out of orphanages and started a married life in a tar paper shack. But I admired the honesty and restraint with which Catherine recounted her conscription into white ladyhood and her remaking as an activist intellectual in the 1920s and 30s. Her portrait of the South as a land scarred by slavery and segregation, but rich in a history of progressive struggle, resonated with how I saw the region. and I saw her generation of often embattled feminists and Southern leftists as the predecessors of my own. They had lived to see progress toward justice reversed during what the playwright Lillian Hellman called scoundrel time, the McCarthyite Red Scare of the 1950s, but they had also lived to see the movements of the 60s and 70s take up many of the causes they had pursued. Still, I was puzzled by Catherine's book. I wondered what happened to her much older sister, Elizabeth, who makes a brief appearance as a wildly popular girl orator on the Confederate Veterans Reunion Circuit at the turn of the 20th century and then disappears from the story. What about her sister Grace, who is never mentioned in the book? For that matter, what about Catherine herself? This is an autobiography, and yet it ends when she is in her 20s and in the 1920s, working with a group of young black women in the YWCA trying to build an interracial student movement in the segregated South. So what about her later life? What about her struggle to carve out a career as a scholar and a writer at a time when men monopolized academic and literary institutions? What about her efforts to extend the New Deal safety net to women and blacks who were initially excluded from programs like Social Security? And what about the decades she spent in Smith College in Northampton, building a vibrant domestic and political life with an economist named Dorothy Douglas, who was the former wife of the prominent Democratic Senator Paul Douglas, and a lifelong supporter of left-wing causes. What about all of that? Well, as it turned out, Elizabeth, the eldest, never strayed far from her upbringing. But Grace decamped to New York in the mid-1920s and plunged into a swirl of sex, art, and revolution. She rose to fame with the publication of her first novel, To Make My Bread, about the legendary Gastonia, North Carolina strike of 1929. By the early 1930s, she was describing herself as a warm fellow traveler of the Communist Party. She was married to her live-in lover, a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe, a militant fur and leather worker with literary aspirations. As the radical movements of the 1930s and 40s gave way to McCarthyism and the Cold War, however, her career and her marriage unraveled. Reversing course entirely, she spent the last decades of her life denouncing her former allies and renouncing her own best work. When I moved to North Carolina in 1973 to launch the Oral History program, I jumped at the chance to seek these women out. Elizabeth had died 10 years before, but I found Grace and Catherine in Virginia, to which both had retired. My conversations with them were fascinating, but again, there was so much that was left unsaid. Here I am interviewing Catherine at a time when I'm just starting out in my career, and she's in the last decades of her life. I think our body language says it all. She is gracious and supportive, but she keeps her own counsel. She says only what she wants to say. She willingly and vividly recalled her early life and work, but she was reluctant to talk about her life after she left the South. I later learned that she also erased large swaths of her life from her private correspondence, destroying much of many of the letters that had not already been burned by earlier by Catherine and Dorothy themselves during the Red Scare and its counterpart, an evil twin, the so-called Lavender Scare. So this is a paragraph from my book. This burning of papers, a scourge of historians seeking to tell the stories we need to know, erased Dorothy Douglas from the narrative of Catherine's life. Gone also were the years when Catherine was cut off from her family, who felt betrayed by her autobiographical revelations. Gone were the 1950s, when McCarthyism turned the pro-labor and civil rights, social democratic ideas and associations of the 30s and 40s into sinister un-American activities and equated same-sex love with treason. Silently omitted, too, was the startling fact that Grace had named names, implicating Catherine and colluding in the storm of red baiting that shattered the life she and her partner had so carefully built. Over the years, after those first interviews, I never lost interest in the Lumpkin sisters, and I kept in touch with Catherine, but I simply could not bring myself to write about them while they were alive, given their deep and determined reticence. When I did start working on this book, I think I can safely say that I left no known stone unturned. But the burning of papers, the scars that bred habits of secrecy, thwarted my hopes of finding what I had found in so many other projects, a treasure trove of documents that would tell me what I wanted to know. Still, little by little, illuminating evidence accumulated. A friend of a friend stumbled across a bitter, furious memoir written by the sister's father, which put him right in the middle of